Now, to begin this tour, I'll give you a brief lecture about the Missouri's history, just so that you're aware of what she's done for the U.S. So you should already be familiar with December 7 of 1941. That's when Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, where we currently are right now is what we call Battleship Row. We had 7 battleships within this line, and the one that suffered the most casualties was the USS Arizona in that direction over there. She lost more than 1,100 sailors from the attack, and it's why she has her own dedicated memorial in the waters. But as for the Missouri, even though she sits here in Pearl Harbor today, she was not here during the bombing. In fact, at that point, she wasn't even a fully built ship yet. Her story began much earlier that year, on January 6 of 1941. That's when construction of this vessel began, and they were building this ship in Brooklyn, New York. It only took 3 years to finish her. The USS Missouri was first launched by January 29 of 1944. Now, when we say that the ship has launched, it basically means it was able to float. Doesn't mean she was ready for battle yet. The Missouri did not get commissioned until June 11 of 1944, and only then was she sent out to the Pacific to fight. So she joined World War II very late. In fact, altogether, the Missouri served less than 14 months in the war. But she did see combat. Her first battle out the gate was Iwo Jima, and then afterwards was Okinawa. Once the Allied powers had conquered those 2 Japanese islands, the Missouri would then go to mainland Japan to do heavy bombardments. So yeah, the battles of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, mainland Japan, those 3 battles earned the Missouri 3 Bronze Stars. Now, even though she didn't fight for very long, there are some people who consider the Missouri as one of the more historic and iconic battleships of World War II. And they say that because when the war ended by September 2 of 1945, the Japanese would board this very ship to come and sign what's called the Instruments of Surrender. Not a peace treaty, the Instruments of Surrender. We'll get to the exact location of the signing on our next stop. Now, do any of you happen to know why the Japanese surrendered on the USS Missouri specifically?
Yes.
Yeah, so that correct answer. So if you didn't hear him, the U.S. president by the end of World War II was Harry S. Truman. He was from the state of Missouri. So it was a very controversial decision because you had 2 older pigs at the time, those of which were the USS Nevada and the USS Texas. Now, both of them served back in World War I, but more importantly, the Nevada was here during the bombing of Pearl Harbor, sitting just past the Arizona. Of course, that didn't matter. Truman ordered that the surrender would happen on the Missouri. And once World War II was over, the Navy already had plans to decommission this ship. They wanted to pull her out of service, because with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japan basically showed everyone that weaponized aircraft were the way of the future. Battleships could not keep up. They were rendered obsolete. It was a real shame for the Missouri and her kind because her story started with World War II, and already it was about to end. But with Truman still being the president, he vetoed that decision. He ordered that while he was still in office, the Missouri would continue her service. And so she did. The Missouri had managed to live on until the 1950s, and by then, she saw her second conflict in Korea. The Korean War lasted from 1950 to 1953. The Missouri would fight the whole 3 years. She was really effective during that time since the North Koreans built a lot of their bases and railways by the shorelines of Korea. All of that was a perfect range of these giant 16-inch 50 caliber guns directly above us. Now, these 16-inchers were the largest guns the U.S. Navy had ever made. They fire out bullets that can travel up to 26 miles away. They'll go that distance in 91 seconds. So if the Missouri were to fire off her guns right now, she could strike any part of the island of Oahu in less than a minute and a half. So during the Korean War, the Missouri would fire these guns at the North Koreans more than 2,800 times for 3 years. Now, the Korean War would end by 1953. 2 years afterwards, in 55, the Navy decommissioned the Missouri for the very first time. They would send her into Bremerton, Washington State, towards the northwest of the U.S., and she would get to join what's called the Mothball Fleet over there, which is basically a retirement home for ships. And she would stay there for 29 years. So sadly, the Missouri did not see any action during the Vietnamese War. Now, skipping over the 3 decades that she slept, jumping over to the mid-80s, from the years of 1984 to 86, the Missouri would undergo a 2-year modernization project. She would get brand new weapons, brand new radars, but most importantly, she finally got air conditioning for the first time. She was getting all that brand new stuff since the Ronald Reagan administration really wanted to bring back the Missouri and her kind for the raw firepower that they had. Plus, it was cheaper to upgrade 600 older ships than to build 600 newer ones. If you try to build a vessel like this one today, you need at least $2.5 billion. To upgrade her costed $450 million. So she was called back to service and was recommissioned by May 10 of 1986. Later on, when you walk around the Missouri on your own, a lot of the equipment you see now are all the upgrades she received during the mid-80s, but they did not touch the 16-inch guns. Now, by 1987, the year after she was recommissioned, the Navy sent her to the Middle East for Operation Earnest Will. That was to defend oil tankers crossing the Mediterranean Sea. Then when Saddam Hussein threatened U.S. oil supplies, the Persian Gulf War broke out in 1990, where she saw through 2 major operations. You may have heard of them. Those operations were Desert Shield and Desert Storm. For the majority of the war, the Missouri resided in Kuwait, which is towards the north of Saudi Arabia. She began to use these 16 inches once more, and they fired at Kuwait more than 600 times within the first 5 days of the conflict. Then by Desert Storm in 1991, she got to use one of her newer weapons, those of which were the Tomahawk missiles. Now, you're not able to see them from here, but the Tomahawks are at the center and at the back of the ship. There were 32 of those in total, and 28 of the 32 were fired off during Desert Storm. Those missiles could travel up to 1,000 miles away with near pinpoint accuracy, and they were the first of their kind as well. Now, when Hussein was defeated, that ended the Gulf War. Soon afterwards, the Navy wanted to decommission the Missouri one last time because after that, they no longer had a use for them. Before that, though, they wanted to give the Missouri one last mission, and that would be Operation Remembrance. It took place on December 7 of 1991, which was the 50-year anniversary since the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The Missouri would come over here to these waters to honor those who had fallen and to be the centerpiece for that event. Finally, March 31 of 1992 was when she was decommissioned for her second and absolute last time. The Navy would send her back into Bremerton, Washington State, and she would sleep there for the rest of her days. So why is she here in Hawaii then? That's because in 1998, the USS Missouri Memorial Association, which is us by the way, we obtained the rights to the Missouri, and then with the U.S. Navy's help, they towed her all the way back here where she currently sits, from Bremerton, Washington, all the way here to Pearl Harbor. That took about 2.5 weeks. She's been here ever since and opened as a museum by January 29 of 1999, 55 years since her launching. And whenever the U.S. Navy launches a ship, that's the day of the vessel's birthday. So earlier this year, on January 29th, the USS Missouri turned to 80 years old, and she's still as beautiful as ever. Now, by raise of hands, how many of you have already been to the USS Arizona Memorial already, or plan to go there later? Also, almost everyone. So we currently have the Missouri facing bow to bow with the Arizona in that direction over there. These two memorials, they make up what we call the quote-unquote bookends of World War II. The Arizona marked the start of that war for the U.S., the Missouri ended that war. And they sit near Pearl Harbor facing each other as a symbol of peace for everyone. This is the most historic and most iconic part of the Missouri. You are stepping on a very important piece of history right now, since this is the exact location where World War II had ended. Now, the day was September 2 of 1945. It was a very cloudy Sunday morning, but on that day, the Missouri was not here in Pearl Harbor. In fact, she was nowhere near Hawaii in general. She was anchored in the waters of Tokyo Bay in Japan. Now, she did not go to the home of the enemy alone. What you don't see in this photo on the turret behind me, the USS Missouri came accompanied with 250 Allied warships. All of them would be surrounding the Missouri, and they had their guns aimed directly at this ship as a show of power. Now, by the end of the war, the Missouri had more than 3,000 people on here. To face those 3,000 plus sailors and soldiers would be 11 Japanese men, and that's them on the right of this photo. Even though it looks like 9 or 10 of them, that's because a few of them are standing in front of one another. So those 11 representatives were sent by Japan's Emperor Hirohito. They boarded the Missouri by 8:56 a.m., they made their way up the ladder we just came from, and they stood in this corner of the deck in front of me. Once they got here, 3 Allied power representatives would emerge from the ship. Those 3 men would be General Douglas MacArthur, he's number 1 in this photo, Admiral William Halsey, who's number 7 above MacArthur, and Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz is not in this picture, he's way towards the left. Those 3 men would appear from the Admiral's quarters, and where that is, if you turn towards your left, the Admiral's quarters is above that metal ladder and behind the white tarp. The 3 of them would exit out of the quarters, make their way down that metal ladder, and then come face to face with the Japanese. Once everyone took their places, at 9:02 a.m., General Douglas MacArthur would walk up to the microphone towards the left of the table, and he would begin the surrender ceremony with a brief opening speech. A lot of people did not know what to expect from MacArthur. Maybe a speech about revenge, anger, punishment, or something like that, considering everything they went through. But nothing of that sort was said. Instead, MacArthur wished that everyone, including Japan, would be allowed freedom, tolerance, and justice. But most importantly, MacArthur wanted to sow the seeds of peace with the Japanese. And that did catch a lot of people off guard, considering a lot of stuff the Japanese army did during the war. But nevertheless, those delegates received MacArthur's message very well. They had a translator with them, and that was number 27 on the far right. He's one of the guys with the top hats. Number 27 is Toshikazu Kase. Kase was born and raised in Japan, but here in America, he graduated out of Harvard University. Later on in his life, Kase would write a book titled Journey to the Missouri, recalling his experience while on this ship. When he first boarded this vessel, Kase felt extremely intimidated, considering the thousands of sailors staring directly at him. But after he heard MacArthur's speech, Kase would let out an audible sigh of relief. And ever since that day, Kase had so much respect for MacArthur, even far after the war was over. So again, if you would like to read that book from Kase in more detail, the book is titled Journey to the Missouri. Also later on in his life, Kase would become an uncle to Yoko Ono. So I just want to slip that fact in there. Right, so going back to the ceremony itself. Once MacArthur's speech was done, then began the actual signing at 9:04 a.m. The first person to sign the instruments of surrender would be the man with the cane, number 22. Number 22 is Mamadou Shigemitsu. Shigemitsu was Japan's foreign minister at the time, and he would be signing for his emperor. Second person assigned would be number 24. Number 24 is General Yoshijiro Umezu. Umezu will be signing for the Japanese Armed Forces. Third person assigned would be MacArthur himself. MacArthur did not sign for the US. Instead, he signed as the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. Now, if you look at the photo, there's two documents on the table. One's white, one's black. They were signing two because they wanted to give one of those documents to Japan and the other to the US. MacArthur would use 6 pence to sign them, using 3 pence to sign one document and a separate 3 pence to sign the other. As he was doing that, MacArthur would donate the first 2 pence that he used to the 2 lieutenant generals standing behind him, numbers 2 and number 3. Number 2 is Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright. He's from the American Army. Number 3 is Lieutenant General Arthur Percival. He's from the UK Army. Both of those men stood more than 6 feet tall, but at the time of this ceremony, neither one of them came close to weighing 100 pounds. Wow. They were both extremely light for their size, since the 2 of them were released from Japanese imprisonment camps a few days before this event. Wainwright was captured in the Philippines. Percival was captured in Singapore. Now, during World War II, the average POW in the Pacific usually didn't last more than 6 months in their captivity. The 2 of them, though, they endured at least 3 years, and they still came out alive. When they got released, MacArthur handpicked those 2 gentlemen to stand behind him so that they could represent all prisoners of war throughout World War II. And again, in honor for their services, MacArthur would give them 1 pen each that he signed. After MacArthur gave them their pens, he would finish signing. Once MacArthur was done, the 4th person to sign would be Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, the one to represent the United States. After Nimitz came the rest of the Allied powers, and those representatives would be from the countries of China, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and then finally New Zealand, all of them signing in that order. Once everyone signed their portion of the documents, at 9:25 a.m., MacArthur would return to the mic, and he would say 2 sentences to end World War II once and for all, and I quote, "Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed." And with that, mankind's most bloodiest conflict would finally come to an end. This ceremony began at 9:02 a.m. and finished up by 9:25 a.m. It just took 23 minutes to stop more than 4 years of war. Obviously, for the Europeans, this was 6 years of war, but what a lot of people don't know is that for the Chinese, this was 14 years of war, and all that ended here on the USS Missouri. Now that's the story of the Surrender Act. We still have one more stop to go, which is the kamikaze attack site. During World War II, the Missouri was struck by a Japanese bomber plane. I'll explain to you how that happened. Already, but for those of you who aren't, during World War II, the kamikaze were not the standard fighter pilots. All they did was just fly themselves into enemy ships, take themselves out, and everyone else they could hit. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, the word kamikaze in Japanese does not translate from death, honor, sacrifice, crash, crazy, or anything like that. Do any of you know the literal translation of the word?
God's wind.
God's divine wind is the correct translation. Well done. So kami means divine, and kaze means wind. Now, the term was first coined all the way back in the 13th century. There used to be a nation in Asia called Mongolia. They wanted to conquer Japan. In the year of 1274, the Mongols had planned to set sail in order to invade. But right before they were about to cross the Japanese Sea, a giant typhoon would block their way, preventing them from invading in the first place. 7 years later, in 1281, the Mongols would try again. They would send a second fleet to invade Japan. As they were traveling through the ocean, the fleet was wrecked by a giant typhoon. The ships were destroyed and many of their forces were lost within the waters. It was after that second failed attempt that Japan believed it was some form of divine intervention, sending down divine winds to protect them, the kamikaze. Now, as for the World War II iteration, they were introduced very late into the conflict. The first time the Japanese had used them was during the Battle of Leyte, and that took place in the Philippines by October of 1944. They were created mainly because building up to that point, Japan was already starting to lose battle after Battle of the Pacific, and because of that, they lost a lot of their more experienced fighter pilots. The Japanese government had decided to draft a lot of teenagers to young adults to pilot these bomb-strap planes, whether they volunteered or not. So it's estimated that at least 4,000 Japanese men had sacrificed their lives doing this. Now, as for this attack against the Missouri, this occurred during the Battle of Okinawa, so imagine the ship there. The date was April 11 of 1945. At the time of 2:42 p.m., sailors on the USS Missouri, as well as nearby Allied warships, they spotted a Japanese plane incoming from the southeast. Everyone opened fire at that direction. As the pilot was approaching, he could not make a direct nosedive onto any of the ships. He needed to avoid the gunfire first in order to make a clean hit. He would continue to fly towards the south, towards the right, until there were less guns firing at him. As he was traveling towards the south, he chose the USS Missouri as his target. The pilot would then lower his altitude in order to make it difficult for the anti-aircraft guns to point down and shoot him. None of the ships could shoot the plane down, so at 2:43 p.m., the very next minute, that plane would successfully strike the starboard side of the Missouri's hull. Luckily, it didn't explode. It just left a dent on the ship and then it fell to the ocean. Now, majority of the plane, including the bomb inside of it, fell into the water harmlessly. The right wing of the plane broke off, though. It landed on the Missouri's wooden decks over there and would tumble towards the surrender deck. As the wing was tumbling forward, it spilled aviation fuel. The friction of the wing striking against its own fuel ignited a fire around that corner of the Missouri. The sailors had to work fast to extinguish all the flames on board, and they did that in less than 3 minutes. Once the fires were put out, they did a head count to check for any casualties. They did not lose a single soul. No one got hurt. But as they were clearing the rubble from that area of the ship, they found the kamikaze pilot laying dead on the right side of the gun turret. He was violently ejected out of the seat on impact. Initially, the sailors wanted to throw the body overboard because they were already throwing rubble up from the plane back into the waters. But the captain of the ship at that time, his name was William Callahan. Callahan was the first ever commanding officer for the USS Missouri. He wanted to do something different. Callahan wanted to give that pilot a proper military burial. Now, of course, there were sailors against the decision. It was an enemy trying to sink us. Why should we honor the guy? In Callahan's opinion, he believed that once an enemy is dead, they are no longer the enemy. The pilot was just another soldier fighting for his country in a time of war. Now, since Callahan was the captain, he ordered all of his sailors to give that pilot a proper burial. And they did. The very next day, April 12 of 1945, the sailors of the USS Missouri would render onto that pilot and bury him out at sea. They would drape the body with the Japanese imperial flag that they had stitched together, and even fired off a 6-gun salute. Some of you may have noticed a bunch of black footprints on the way over here. Yeah. Where those footprints are is where the burial had happened. Now, for many years, not a lot of people knew about this story. In fact, the sailors that witnessed all that firsthand, they didn't even know who the pilot was. They didn't get to know his name or his face. It was only in the late 90s that researchers of the Missouri come to identify the pilot. We believe that it was a second-class petty officer. In the U.S. Army, that's the same thing as a sergeant. The petty officer's name was Setsuo Ishino. When Ishino had passed away on those decks over there, he was 19 years old. Oh. We walked by 3 storyboards on the way over here, and each of those storyboards has a different detail about the event. The first board outside this tent will talk about the Battle of Okinawa. That's where the attack took place. The second storyboard after that will have a picture of the plane right before it was about to hit. And the third storyboard all the way forward, where the black footprints are, will have various photos of the burial. It's also going to have 2 pictures of Setsuo Ishino himself. The photos you'll see of the pilots, they were physically provided by his family when they boarded the Missouri back in 2001. As for the exact area where the plane had struck, it's next to the second storyboard. You're going to see this little sign hanging on the netting that says Kamikaze Crashed Here. Walk up to that sign, look over the net, you're going to find 2 black and yellow tapes on the edge of the ship. And in between those tapes will be the dent that was left behind. Now, usually with these kind of memorials inside the U.S., we mainly just honor those who fought for our country or for our side. But here at the USS Missouri and in Pearl Harbor in general, we honor all those who have fallen, whether friend or foe. The dent that was left behind was never repaired for the past 79 years, and that entire area of the ship out there is how we remember and how we continue to honor Setsuo Ishino. Not only that, beneath us is the second deck. It functions as our museum. When you first go down there, you will see our kamikaze exhibit, and in that exhibit, you get to see the uniform that the pilots had worn, and you even get to read their last letters home.